The marble floor of the courtroom echoed with the sharp click of expensive Italian leather shoes, each step a deliberate announcement that someone who believed himself royalty had arrived. If you believe that justice should apply equally to everyone, no matter their last name or bank account, hit that like button right now. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Courtroom 7, casting long shadows across the polished oak benches that had witnessed decades of human drama, triumph, and downfall. The air carried that particular weight that courtrooms possess, a mixture of old wood, recycled air, and the accumulated tension of 1,000 verdicts. But today, that tension would reach a breaking point that no one present would ever forget. Judge Elias Monroe sat behind the bench with the quiet authority of a man who had spent 40 years separating truth from lies, justice from theater. His silver hair was combed back neatly, his black robe immaculate, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose as he reviewed the case file before him. At 63, Judge Monroe had presided over murder trials, corruption cases, and every shade of human failure in between. His face was lined with the weight of those decisions, but his eyes remained sharp, clear, and utterly uncompromising. He was not a man who could be impressed, intimidated, or bought. The bailiff stood near the door, his posture rigid, his expression carefully neutral as he watched the defense side of the courtroom. The prosecutor, Maria Castellanos, sat at her table with 3 thick binders of evidence arranged before her, like weapons waiting to be deployed. She was a woman in her late 40s, sharp-featured, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched the severity of her preparation. She had not lost a case in 2 years, and she had no intention of breaking that streak today. But all eyes in the courtroom kept drifting to the defense table, where 28-year-old Harrison Blackwell III sat with the kind of casual arrogance that came from never hearing the word no in his entire life. He wore a 3-piece suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, his blonde hair styled with the precision of someone who had a personal barber on retainer. His lawyer, Gerald Pembroke, sat beside him, an older man with gray temples and a reputation for getting rich clients out of trouble through procedural gymnastics and aggressive intimidation tactics. Harrison wasn't just wealthy.
He was generationally wealthy, trust fund wealthy, the kind of wealthy where money stopped being real and became abstract. His great-grandfather had built half of the city's infrastructure. His grandfather had doubled the family fortune through real estate development. His father currently sat on the boards of 6 major corporations and played golf with senators. The Blackwell name was carved into buildings, printed on hospital wings, and whispered in country clubs across 3 states.
And Harrison Blackwell III believed, with absolute conviction, that this courtroom was merely a formality, an inconvenient performance he had to endure before returning to his penthouse apartment and his life of consequence-free indulgence. The charges against him were serious: vehicular manslaughter while driving under the influence, leaving the scene of an accident, and obstruction of justice. 3 months earlier, Harrison had been driving his Lamborghini Aventador through downtown at nearly twice the speed limit after leaving an exclusive nightclub where he'd consumed, by multiple witness accounts, at least 8 cocktails. At the intersection of 5th and Broadway, he'd run a red light and struck a Honda Civic carrying Miguel Reyes, a 52-year-old construction worker and father of 3, who was on his way home from a double shift. Miguel Reyes died at the scene. His car had been crushed like an aluminum can. The Lamborghini barely had a scratch. Harrison hadn't stopped. He'd accelerated away from the scene, called his father, and by the time police located him 3 hours later at the family estate, his legal team was already assembled, and he'd had time to sober up enough to make the blood alcohol test inadmissible. The family had attempted to make the entire problem disappear, offering settlements, applying pressure through connected friends, suggesting that perhaps the construction worker had been at fault, that perhaps the light had been yellow, that perhaps Harrison had panicked rather than fled. But Maria Castellanos had built a case brick by brick. She had traffic camera footage. She had witnesses from the nightclub. She had the bartender who'd served Harrison drink after drink. She had the 911 calls, the skid marks, the reconstruction analysis. She had the truth, and she was going to make it impossible to ignore. The gallery behind the bar was packed. On one side sat the Reyes family, Miguel's widow Elena, her eyes red and swollen from months of grief that would never fully heal. Their 3 children, teenagers trying to look strong while their world had been shattered. Miguel's brother, his mother, cousins, friends, co-workers who'd taken off work to be here, to witness, to demand that their Miguel's life had meant something. On the other side of the gallery, in stark contrast, sat two representatives from the Blackwell family, Harrison's uncle and a family attorney, dressed in expensive suits and wearing expressions of mild annoyance, as if this entire proceeding was beneath their dignity. Harrison's parents weren't even present. They'd sent their regrets through their lawyer. Too busy, too uncomfortable, too confident that this would be handled. Judge Monroe looked up from the case file, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom with the weight of decades of authority. "We are here today for the trial of the state versus Harrison Blackwell III," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the space without needing to be raised. "The defendant is charged with vehicular manslaughter, leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death, and obstruction of justice. These are serious charges that demand serious consideration." Harrison leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a slight smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. He whispered something to his lawyer, who nodded and made a note. Judge Monroe's eyes locked onto that gesture, and something cold flickered in his expression, but he continued. "Ms. Castellanos, you may present your opening statement." Maria stood, buttoning her jacket with crisp precision. She walked to the center of the courtroom, and when she spoke, her voice was controlled, but filled with restrained fury. "Your Honor, members of the jury, what I'm about to present to you is not complicated. This is not a case of uncertain evidence or ambiguous circumstances. This is a case about choice. On the night of March 14th, the defendant, Harrison Blackwell III, made a series of choices. He chose to drink excessively at the Sapphire Lounge. He chose to get behind the wheel of a high-performance sports car. He chose to drive at dangerous speeds through populated streets. He chose to run a red light. And when his choices resulted in the death of Miguel Reyes, a hard-working father of 3, Harrison Blackwell III chose to flee the scene, chose to call his lawyers instead of 911, chose to protect himself rather than render aid to the man whose life he'd just taken. She paused, letting that sink in, her eyes moving across the jury. Miguel Reyes was 52 years old. He'd worked in construction for 30 years, often pulling double shifts to provide for his family. He was on his way home that night, obeying every traffic law, when the defendant's vehicle struck his car with such force that Miguel died instantly. The defendant didn't stop, didn't call for help, didn't even slow down. Because in Harrison Blackwell's world, other people's lives are obstacles, not equals. Harrison rolled his eyes, and this time it wasn't subtle. Several jury members noticed. Elena Reyes began crying softly, her daughter's arm around her shoulders. "The evidence will show," Maria continued, her voice rising slightly, "that this was not an accident. This was the inevitable result of arrogance, entitlement, and complete disregard for human life. And I will prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Harrison Blackwell III is guilty of every charge against him." She returned to her seat, and the courtroom seemed to vibrate with the weight of her words. Judge Monroe nodded. "Mr. Pembroke, your opening statement." Gerald Pembroke stood slowly, adjusting his cufflinks, his expression one of practiced sympathy mixed with condescension. He was good at his job, and his job was making wealthy criminals sympathetic. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what we have here is a tragedy, certainly. The loss of any life is sad, but tragedy does not equal criminality. My client, Harrison Blackwell, is a young man who has contributed significantly to this community through his family's philanthropic work. On the night in question, he was involved in an unfortunate incident. Unfortunate incident. The words burst from Elena Reyes before she could stop herself, her voice breaking. "He murdered my husband." "Order!" Judge Monroe's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. His gaze moved to Elena, and while his tone was firm, his eyes held sympathy. "Mrs. Reyes, I understand your pain, but I cannot allow outbursts in my courtroom. I must ask you to remain silent, or I will have to ask you to leave." Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face, her hand over her mouth as her daughter held her tighter. Pembroke continued, unfazed. "As I was saying, my client was involved in an incident. The prosecution will present a narrative designed to inflame your emotions, but I ask you to look at the facts. There is no conclusive blood alcohol evidence, because the test was delayed. The traffic camera footage is grainy and inconclusive about the color of the traffic signal, and my client's decision to leave the scene, while perhaps ill-advised, was the result of panic and shock, not criminal intent. He paced slowly, hands behind his back, voice smooth as silk. Harrison Blackwell comes from a family that has built this city. His great-grandfather laid the foundations for the very infrastructure we all rely on. His family has donated millions to hospitals, schools, and community programs. This is not a young man disposed to criminal behavior. This is a young man who made a mistake, who panics in a moment of crisis, and who is now being prosecuted because of his last name and his family's success. Several jury members looked skeptical, but Pembroke pressed on. I ask you to see past the prosecution's emotional manipulation and look at the evidence objectively. When you do, you'll see that there is reasonable doubt in every aspect of this case. Thank you. He sat down, and Harrison nodded approvingly, that smirk returning to his face. Judge Monroe's expression remained neutral, but those who knew him well would have recognized the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his jaw set just a fraction harder. Ms. Castellanos, call your first witness. The prosecution calls Officer Raymond Chen to the stand. Officer Chen, a 15-year veteran of the police force with a reputation for thoroughness, took the stand and was sworn in. His testimony was methodical and damning. He described arriving at the scene, finding Miguel Reyes's body still in the driver's seat, the devastating impact, the debris field that stretched for 50 yards. He described the immediate canvas for witnesses, the traffic camera footage that was pulled within hours, the eyewitness accounts that all corroborated the same story. A dark sports car, excessive speed, running the light, the sickening crash, the roar of the engine as it fled. And how long did it take to identify the defendant's vehicle? Maria asked. Less than 6 hours. The Lamborghini Aventador is a distinctive vehicle, and we had partial plate information from witnesses. When we located it at the Blackwell estate, the front end showed clear signs of impact. Paint transfer matching the victim's vehicle, structural damage consistent with the collision. And the defendant's condition when you found him? He was showered, wearing fresh clothes and surrounded by attorneys who instructed him not to speak. We requested a blood alcohol test, but due to the delay and the legal intervention, it was not administered until several hours after the collision, making the results inadmissible. Harrison leaned forward and whispered something to Pembroke, who nodded and stood for cross-examination. Officer Chen, isn't it true that you cannot definitively prove my client was driving the vehicle at the time of the collision? The vehicle is registered to him, and multiple witnesses identified him as the driver. But you didn't see him driving it, did you? No, I arrived after the incident. And this traffic camera footage you mentioned, can it clearly identify the driver's face? No, but thank you, officer. No further questions. The pattern continued through the morning. Maria called the bartender from the Sapphire Lounge, who testified that Harrison had consumed at least 8 cocktails over 3 hours and had been visibly intoxicated, stumbling and slurring his words when he left. She called 3 eyewitnesses who had been on the street that night, each describing the Lamborghini's reckless speed, the way it had blown through the red light without hesitation, the horrible sound of the impact. She called the accident reconstruction expert, who used diagrams and physics to demonstrate that the defendant's vehicle had been traveling at approximately 85 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone, and that the force of impact had been so severe that survival was impossible. With each witness, Pembroke tried to introduce doubt, attacking credibility, questioning timing, suggesting alternative explanations, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury's expressions grew grimmer with each testimony. Finally, late in the afternoon, Maria called Elena Reyes to the stand. The courtroom went absolutely silent as Miguel's widow walked slowly to the witness box, her steps heavy with grief. She wore a simple black dress, her face drawn and pale, her hands trembling as she placed them on the Bible to be sworn in. When she sat, she looked directly at Harrison Blackwell, and he looked away, examining his fingernails with exaggerated disinterest. Maria's voice was gentle, respectful. Mrs. Reyes, can you tell the court about your husband, Miguel? Elena's voice was barely above a whisper at first, but it grew stronger as she spoke. Miguel was everything. He was my best friend for 30 years. We met when we were 20, got married 3 years later. He worked construction because he was good with his hands, and he was proud of his work. He helped build schools, hospitals, homes for families. He'd come home exhausted, with his hands rough and his back aching, but he never complained. He'd help the kids with homework, fix things around the house, always had a smile. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't stop. He worked double shifts so we could save for our daughter's college, for our son's braces, for our youngest's music lessons. Every penny he earned went to making our lives better. And on March 14th, he was just driving home. Just driving home after working 16 hours. He was supposed to walk through the door at midnight. We were going to have leftover tamales together and watch the end of a movie. That's all. That's all he was doing. Coming home to us. And how has his death affected your family? Elena's composure broke completely. It destroyed us. Our children lost their father. I lost my husband. We lost our provider, our protector, our everything. Our oldest had to drop out of college to get a job. We might lose our house because we can't keep up with the mortgage. But worse than all of that, we lost the person who held us together. Miguel was the center of our family, and now there's just this hole that nothing can fill. She looked directly at Harrison again, her voice rising with anguish and fury. And he didn't even stop. He hit my husband, killed him, and drove away like Miguel was nothing, like our family was nothing, like 30 years of love and work and sacrifice meant nothing because we're not rich, because we're not powerful, because we don't have a famous last name. The courtroom was electric with emotion. Several jury members were crying. Even the bailiff had to look away. "Thank you, Mrs. Reyes," Maria said softly. No further questions. Pembroke stood, and everyone could feel him calculating, weighing whether cross-examination would be worth the risk. "Mrs. Reyes, I'm very sorry for your loss," he began carefully. "But you weren't present at the scene of the accident, correct?" "No. So you cannot testify to what actually happened that night, only to your grief afterward." Maria shot to her feet. "Objection. Counsel is badgering the witness." "Sustained," Judge Monroe said coldly. "Mr. Pembroke, tread carefully." Withdrawn. No further questions. Elena stepped down, and as she passed the defense table, Harrison muttered something under his breath. It wasn't loud, but it was audible enough that the people nearby heard it. "Finally, she's done crying." The reaction was instantaneous. Gasps rippled through the gallery. A jury member's mouth fell open in shock. Elena froze, turning to stare at Harrison in disbelief. Even Pembroke looked horrified, reaching out to grab his client's arm. Judge Monroe's gavel came down once, sharp as a gunshot. "What did you just say?" Harrison looked up, realizing his mistake, but unable to back down, his arrogance overriding any sense of self-preservation. "I said it's a lot of theatrics. We get it. She's sad. We're all very moved." The courtroom exploded. People began shouting. Elena's family surged forward, held back by the bailiff. Maria was on her feet, her face flushed with fury. The jury looked stunned, some shaking their heads in disgust. "Order!" Judge Monroe's voice thundered through the chaos, and the courtroom fell silent instantly. His eyes were locked on Harrison with an intensity that made the temperature in the room seem to drop. "Mr. Blackwell, you will stand." Harrison glanced at Pembroke, who urgently gestured for him to comply. Slowly, with visible reluctance, Harrison stood, his expression still carrying that infuriating hint of a smirk. "Do you understand?" Judge Monroe said, his voice quiet now but carrying more weight than any shout, "that this is a court of law. Do you understand that a man is dead, that a family has been destroyed, and that your actions are the reason why?" Harrison shrugged. "Allegedly." The word hung in the air like poison. Pembroke closed his eyes in despair. He knew what was coming. Judge Monroe removed his glasses slowly, folding them with deliberate care, and set them on the bench. When he spoke, every word was measured, controlled, but filled with barely contained fury. "Let me tell you something, Mr. Blackwell. I have sat on this bench for 40 years. I have presided over thousands of cases, seen every kind of criminal, every kind of victim, every shade of human behavior. I have seen genuine remorse. I have seen fear. I have seen people broken by their own mistakes. And I have seen arrogance. But I have never, in 40 years, seen someone sit in my courtroom and mock a widow's grief for her murdered husband." Harrison's smirk was fading now, a flicker of uncertainty entering his eyes. "You believe you're special," Judge Monroe continued. his voice rising slightly. "You believe that your family's money, your last name, your connections, somehow place you above the law, above decency, above basic human empathy. You sit there with your expensive suit and your dismissive attitude, and you think this is all just an inconvenience, a formality before you return to your consequence-free existence." The judge stood, and the effect was dramatic, his full authority radiating from the bench like a physical force. "But let me be absolutely clear. This is not your father's boardroom. This is not your country club. This is a court of law, and in this court, your money means nothing. Your family's name means nothing. Your connections mean nothing. In this court, you are equal to every person who has ever stood before me, and you will be judged by the same standards as every other person who has taken a life." Harrison's face had gone pale. The smirk was completely gone now, replaced by something closer to fear. "You say your family built this city," Judge Monroe said, his voice dropping to something cold and final. "Perhaps they did. Perhaps your great-grandfather laid foundations, and your grandfather built buildings. But you have built nothing. You have contributed nothing. You have taken a man's life through your recklessness and arrogance, and you dare to sit in the courthouse that citizens built, paid for with their taxes, their work, their belief in justice, and mock a widow's pain." He leaned forward, hands on the bench. "Your family's name might be on buildings, Mr. Blackwell, but justice is not for sale. This courtroom belongs to the people, all the people, and in here, you will show respect, or I will hold you in contempt. Do I make myself clear?" Harrison managed a nod, his voice small. "Yes, Your Honor." "Sit down." Harrison sat, and the courtroom remained dead silent, the weight of Judge Monroe's words settling over everyone present. The trial continued into its third day, with the prosecution presenting the final pieces of evidence. Phone records showing Harrison had called his father and lawyer immediately after the collision, but never called emergency services. Security footage from the family estate showing him arriving home. The timeline that proved he'd had ample opportunity to render aid, but chose instead to protect himself. When it was the defense's turn, Pembroke tried to present character witnesses. A college professor who remembered Harrison as a decent student, a family friend who spoke about the Blackwell family's philanthropy, but the damage was done. The jury had seen who Harrison truly was, and no amount of character witness testimony could erase that moment when he'd mocked Elena Reyes's grief. Finally, it was time for closing arguments. Maria Castellanos stood before the jury, her voice strong and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not complicated. Harrison Blackwell III got drunk, got behind the wheel, drove recklessly, killed Miguel Reyes, and fled the scene. Every piece of evidence confirms this. Every witness testimony supports this. And then, in this very courtroom, the defendant showed you exactly who he is. He showed you that he has no remorse, no empathy, no recognition that he has taken a life. He mocked a widow's grief because in his world, people like Miguel Reyes don't matter. But they do matter. Miguel mattered, his family matters, and justice matters. Find Harrison Blackwell guilty on all counts, because that's what the evidence demands and what justice requires." Pembroke's closing was weaker, desperate. He talked about reasonable doubt that didn't exist, about the rush to judgment, about how one moment of poor judgment shouldn't define a life. But his heart wasn't in it, and everyone could tell. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood, her face grave. "We find the defendant, Harrison Blackwell III, guilty of vehicular manslaughter while driving under the influence, guilty of leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death, guilty of obstruction of justice." Elena Reyes collapsed in her daughter's arms, sobbing with relief. The Blackwell family representatives left immediately, faces tight with fury. Harrison sat motionless, the reality finally crashing down on him. 2 weeks later, the courtroom reconvened for sentencing. Harrison stood before Judge Monroe, his expensive suit replaced with a standard shirt and tie, his arrogance replaced with genuine fear. Pembroke had advised him to show remorse, to apologize, to beg for leniency, but Harrison couldn't quite manage it, even now. He read from a prepared statement about being sorry, about learning and growing, but the words sounded hollow, performative. Judge Monroe listened without expression. When Harrison finished and sat down, the judge opened the sentencing file and began to speak. "Mr. Blackwell, I have given a great deal of thought to your sentence. I have considered your age, your lack of prior criminal record, your family circumstances. I have read letters submitted on your behalf by family members, friends, and associates, all asking for mercy, and I have balanced those considerations against the gravity of your crimes, the devastating impact on the Reyes family, and your complete lack of genuine remorse." He paused, letting the silence stretch. This court recognizes that sentencing serves multiple purposes: punishment, deterrence, rehabilitation, and protection of society.
In your case, I find that all four purposes demand significant incarceration. Harrison's face went white. For the crime of vehicular manslaughter while driving under the influence, I sentence you to 15 years in state prison. For leaving the scene of an accident resulting in death, I sentence you to an additional 5 years, to run consecutively. For obstruction of justice, I sentence you to 3 years, also consecutive. That is a total of 23 years. Gasps filled the courtroom.
Pembroke was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, that is an extraordinarily harsh sentence." "It is an appropriate sentence," Judge Monroe cut him off. "Your client showed no mercy to Miguel Reyes. He showed no mercy to the Reyes family. He showed no remorse in this courtroom, instead choosing to mock the pain he caused. The law allows for these sentences, and I am imposing them in full." He looked directly at Harrison, who was now trembling, tears finally beginning to fall. "Perhaps in prison, Mr. Blackwell, you will learn what your family's money could never teach you, that actions have consequences, that other people's lives have value, and that no one, no matter their last name or bank account, is above the law. Perhaps you will learn genuine remorse. Perhaps you will learn to be a better person. But regardless of whether you learn those lessons, you will serve this sentence, and the Reyes family will have at least some measure of justice." He brought his gavel down. Court is adjourned. As the bailiffs moved to take Harrison into custody, his composure finally shattered completely. He turned to his family representatives, reaching out desperately. "Uncle James, do something. Call Dad. You can't let them do this." But his uncle was already walking away, followed by the family attorney, both of them unwilling to be associated with this public humiliation. Harrison's legs gave out, and the bailiffs had to support him as they led him away, his expensive watch and designer clothes stark against the handcuffs now locked around his wrists. His cries echoed through the courtroom until the door closed behind him. Elena Reyes stood in the gallery, her children around her, all of them crying, but with a different quality now: relief, vindication, the first possibility of healing. Maria Castellanos approached them, shaking hands, offering tissues, her own eyes wet with emotion. Judge Monroe gathered his files slowly, his face weary but satisfied. 40 years on the bench, and moments like this still mattered, still felt like they carried weight and meaning. He looked once more at the empty defense table, then at the Reyes family embracing in the gallery, and allowed himself a small nod. Justice had been served. Outside the courthouse, news crews swarmed, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. The story would dominate headlines for weeks: the arrogant heir brought down, the immigrant family vindicated, the judge who refused to be impressed by money or name. It would spark conversations about wealth, privilege, and the justice system. Some would praise the sentence as appropriate, others would call it harsh. But everyone would remember that moment when Harrison Blackwell III had mocked a widow's grief and learned too late that in Judge Elias Monroe's courtroom, arrogance was not a shield, but a guarantee of accountability. And in a modest home across the city, Elena Reyes would light a candle next to Miguel's photograph, finally able to tell him that the man who'd taken his life would answer for it, that their family's pain had been acknowledged, that justice, however imperfect, had been done. The marble floors of Courtroom 7 would see many more cases, many more lives intersecting at the point of judgment. But those who had witnessed State v. Blackwell would never forget the lesson learned that day, that the courthouse belongs to all people equally, that justice cannot be bought or bullied, and that when you walk into court believing yourself above the law, you might walk out in handcuffs. If you believe that justice should never have a price tag, that every life has equal value regardless of wealth or status, and that arrogance should never trump accountability, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and let me know where you're watching from. These stories matter because they remind us that the law, at its best, is the great equalizer, where every person, rich or poor, powerful or powerless, stands equal before the scales of justice. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that accountability still exists, that justice still matters, and that no one, absolutely no one, is above the law.